Colonel Halifax's Ghost Story. I had just returned to England after spending several years in India. I was excited to catch up with my friends, especially Sir Francis Lynton. We had been classmates at Eton, and during my short time at Oxford before joining the army, we had been at the same college. Since then, our lives had taken different paths. He became the head of the family estate in Yorkshire after his grandfather died, while I traveled the world. I had visited him in Yorkshire for a few days before leaving for India. It was a delight to receive a letter from Lynton a few days after my arrival in London. He'd seen in the paper that I was back and invited me to come to Byfield, his home in Yorkshire. "Don't even think about saying you can't make it," he wrote. "You're coming on Monday. I have a couple of horses that would be perfect for you. The carriage will meet you at Packham, and all you need to do is catch the 12 o'clock train from King's Cross." So, on the appointed day, I set off. After a frustrating delay on a dreadful branch line, I arrived at Packham and found Sir Francis's dog cart waiting. I was soon on my way to Byfield. The house was familiar. It was a low, gabled building, not very large, with old-fashioned lattice windows. A charming terraced garden separated the house from the deer park. The moment the carriage wheels crunched on the gravel driveway, almost before I could ring the doorbell, the front door swung open, and there stood Lynton himself. I hadn't seen him in years. He hadn't changed much, and his face beamed with joy. He took both my hands and pulled me into the house, taking my hat and coat. He looked me up and down, then started talking excitedly about how happy he was to see me, how thrilled he was to finally have me under his roof again, and how much fun we were going to have together, just like old times. He'd already had my luggage sent up to my room, which was ready, and told me to hurry and get dressed for dinner. He led me through a paneled hall, up an old oak staircase, and showed me my room. I was in such a rush, I just noticed that the walls were covered in tapestry, and there was a large four-post bed with velvet curtains opposite the window. By the time I came downstairs, everyone else was already at dinner, even though I'd hurried, but they'd saved a place for me next to Lady Lynton. Besides my hosts, there were their two daughters, Colonel Lynton, Sir Francis's brother, the chaplain, and some other people I didn't really remember. After dinner, there was music in the hall and a game of whist in the drawing room. After the ladies had gone upstairs, Lynton and I retired to the smoking room, where we talked for hours. It must have been nearly 3 in the morning when I finally went to bed. I slept so soundly that my servant's arrival the next morning didn't wake me. It was past 9 when I woke up. After breakfast and catching up on the news, Lynton went to deal with his mail. I asked Lady Lynton if one of her daughters could show me around the house. Elizabeth, the eldest, agreed. The house wasn't large, occupying 3 sides of a square, with the entrance and a part of the stables making up the 4th side. The interior was fascinating. Passageways, rooms, galleries, and the hall were all paneled in dark wood and adorned with paintings. Elizabeth showed me everything on the ground floor, then the 1st floor. She then suggested we go up a narrow, twisting staircase leading to a gallery. We did, entering a long, handsome room or passage that led to a small chamber at one end, where her father kept books and papers. I asked if anyone slept in the gallery, as I'd noticed a bed, a fireplace, and rods for curtains. The curtains could be drawn to create a cozy little room with the bed and fireplace. She replied, "No." The space was rarely used, except as a playroom. She'd heard it had been occupied sometimes when the house was full, back in her great-grandfather's day. By the time we had toured the house, the garden, and the stables, and I'd met the dogs, it was almost 1 o'clock. We were to have a light lunch and then drive to see the ruins of an old Yorkshire abbey. It was a lovely day, soft with bright sunshine, typical of early November. We reached the hilltop where Lynton expected to meet the hounds, but there was no sign of them. They must have found a good scent and gone in a different direction. After a late lunch, Lynton reluctantly gave up hope of catching up with the hounds and said we'd take a different route home. As we descended the hill, we came across an old chalk quarry and the remains of a disused kiln. I recognized the spot at once. I'd been there with Sir Francis on my previous visit years ago. "Good heavens," I said. "Do you remember what happened here when I was with you before?" Some workers were removing chalk and came across a skeleton under a lot of rubble. We went to see it removed, and you said you'd keep it until an expert could examine it. What was the result?" Sir Francis hesitated a moment, then said, "It's true. I had the remains removed." "Was there an inquest?" "No. I had been excavating some burial mounds on the wolds. I'd sent a crouching skeleton and some skulls to the Scarborough Museum. I wasn't sure about this one. Whether it was a prehistoric burial. No one thought of an inquest." When we got back to the house, one of the grooms who took our horses, in response to Lynton's question, said that Colonel and Mrs. Hampshire had arrived about an hour ago. They'd driven over from Castle Frampton, and one of their horses was lame, so their carriage was staying the night. In the drawing room, we found Lady Lynton pouring tea for her sister-in-law and her husband. As we entered, they exclaimed, "We've come to ask for a night's lodging." They explained they'd been visiting in the neighborhood and had to leave suddenly because of a death at the house where they were staying. They hadn't been able to find a carriage, so their hosts had sent them to Byfield. "We thought," Mrs. Hampshire continued, "as we were coming to visit next week, you wouldn't mind having us a little earlier. Or, if the house is full, you'd be willing to put us up somewhere until Monday, and we could come back later." Lady Lynton quickly interjected that everything was settled, then turned to her husband, saying, "But I need to talk to you for a moment." They both left the room. Lynton came back almost immediately, making an excuse to point out our ride on a map in the hall, saying as soon as we were alone with a look of annoyance, "I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to change rooms. Would you mind terribly? I think we can make you comfortable upstairs in the gallery. That's the only room left. Lady Lynton has already lit a fire. It's not really cold, and it's only for a night or two. Your servant has been told to pack your things, but Lady Lynton didn't want to move them without me speaking to you first. I assured him I didn't mind at all. I'd be just as comfortable upstairs, but I did mind them making such a fuss over something so trivial with an old friend. Certainly, nothing could have looked more comfortable than my new lodgings when I went up to get dressed. There was a roaring fire in the grate. An armchair had been pulled up near it. All my books and writing things were there, with a reading lamp in the perfect spot, and the heavy tapestry curtains were drawn, making a private room out of this part of the gallery. I was tempted to congratulate myself on the change. The spiral staircase was one reason why the Hampshires couldn't stay in the gallery. No lady's luggage could have fit up those narrow stairs. Sir Francis was understandably busy with his sister and her husband, who he hadn't seen in a while. Colonel Hampshire had also just heard that he might be sent to Egypt. When Lynton and Hampshire retired to the smoking room, I stayed upstairs in my room to finish a book I was enjoying. I didn't stay up late, though, and soon went to bed. Before I did, I pulled back the curtains, partly because I like a lot of air when I sleep, and partly because I wanted to see the moonlight on the floor in the part of the gallery beyond where I was, where the blinds hadn't been drawn. I must have been asleep for a while, because the fire, which I'd left blazing, had died down to just a few sparks wandering among the ashes, when I suddenly woke up with the feeling that I'd heard a latch click at the far end of the gallery, near the chamber with the books and papers. I've always been a light sleeper, but this time I woke up completely alert, with a feeling of heightened awareness that seemed to sharpen all my senses. The wind had picked up, blowing in gusts around the house. A minute or two passed, and I started to think I'd imagined it, when I distinctly heard the creak of the door, then the click of the latch as it fell back into place. Then I heard a sound on the floorboards, as if someone was moving in the gallery. I sat up to listen, and as I did, I clearly heard footsteps coming down the gallery. They approached and passed my bed. I couldn't see anything. It was dark. But I heard the tread continuing towards the uncurtained windows, 2 of them. But the moon shone through only one, the nearest. The other window was dark, shadowed by the chapel or some other building at a right angle. The tread seemed to pause every few steps, then continue as before. I fixed my eyes on the moonlit window, and it seemed as if some dark figure passed across it. But what? I listened intently and heard the step continue to the end of the gallery, then turn back. I watched the lit window again. As soon as the sound reached that part of the passage, it stopped momentarily. I saw, as clearly as I'd ever seen anything, a figure of a man with distinctive features, wearing what looked like a fur cap pulled down over his brows. It was in silhouette against the moonlight. He stood in the window embrasure, then moved on, and as he did, I heard the tread again. I was sure, absolutely certain, that whatever it was, whatever this person was coming towards my bed. I threw myself back onto the bed, and as I did, a piece of charred wood from the hearth fell down, sending a flash of sparks, red as blood, into the darkness. By that light, I saw a face near me. With a cry completely out of my control, as if I were having a nightmare, I called out, "Who are you?" For a moment, my hair stood on end as I braced myself to grapple with the being next to me in the darkness, when a floorboard creaked as if someone moved, and I heard the footsteps retreat. I heard the click of the latch again. The next instant, there was a rush on the stairs, and Lynton burst into the room just as he had jumped out of bed, calling, "For God's sake, what's wrong? Are you ill?" I couldn't answer. Lynton struck a light and leaned over the bed. Then I grabbed his arm and said without moving, "There's been something in this room. Gone in there." The words were barely out of my mouth when Lynton, following the direction of my eyes, jumped to the end of the corridor and flung open the door there. He went into the room beyond, looked around, then returned and said, "You must have been dreaming." By now, I was out of bed. "Look for yourself," I said, and he led me into the small room. It was empty, with cupboards and boxes, a kind of junk room. "There's nothing beyond this," he said. "No door, no staircase. It's a dead end." He added, "Now put on your dressing gown and come down to my study." I followed him. After he'd spoken to Lady Lynton, who was standing with her bedroom door ajar, clearly agitated, he turned to me and said, "No one could have been in your room. You see, my wife's and my apartments are right below yours, and no one could come up the spiral staircase without passing my door. You must have had a nightmare. As soon as you screamed, I ran upstairs and didn't see anyone coming down. There's no place to hide in that junk room at the end of the gallery." He then took me into his private study, lit a fire, lit a lamp, and said, "I'd really appreciate it if you'd keep this to yourself. There are some people in the house and neighborhood who are silly enough to believe in such things. Stay here and read if you don't feel like going to bed. I'll bring you some books. I need to go to Lady Lynton. She's quite frightened and doesn't want to be alone." He went to his bedroom. Sleep, for me, was out of the question. I don't think Sir Francis or his wife slept much either. I built up the fire and picked up a book, trying to read, but it was no use. I sat there lost in thought, questioning everything until I heard the servants stirring in the morning. I went to my room, left the candle burning, and got into bed. I'd just fallen asleep when my servant brought me a cup of tea at 8 o'clock. At breakfast, Colonel Hampshire and his wife asked if anything had happened during the night, as they'd been disturbed by noises overhead. Lynton replied that I hadn't been well and had an attack of cramps, and that he'd been upstairs to look after me. I could see he wanted me to keep quiet, so I said nothing. In the afternoon, when everyone had gone out, Sir Francis took me into his study and said, "Halifax, I'm so sorry about last night. It's true, what my brother said. People have heard noises in this house, but I've always ignored them, attributing them to rats. But after what you experienced, I feel it's my duty to tell you something and to give you an explanation. There was no one in that room at the end of the corridor, except the skeleton that was found in the chalk pit when you were here all those years ago. I confess, I hadn't paid much attention to it. My archaeological interests faded. I never showed the bones or skull to any experts. They're just packed away in a chest in that junk room. I should have buried them, but I forgot all about them, or at least I didn't think about it. But what you've experienced and what you've told me has made me uneasy, and I have a suspicion I can explain it in a way that hadn't occurred to me before." He paused, then added, "What I'm going to tell you is a secret. No one else knows, and you must not mention it, at least not while I'm alive. You know, because of my father's early death, my brother, sister, and I were raised by our grandfather, Sir Richard. He was an old, imperious, hot-tempered man. I'll tell you what I've pieced together from something that was a mystery for a long time, and then I'll tell you how I figured it out. My grandfather was in the habit of going out at night with a young underkeeper, whom he was very fond of, to check on the game and see if any poachers, whom he considered his natural enemies, were around. One night, he continued, my grandfather was out with the young man, and they were returning through the plantation, where the hill is steepest, not far from the chalk pit you mentioned yesterday, when they came across a man who, though not local, was well known in the area. He was a traveling tinker with a bad reputation and a notorious poacher. Now, I'm not sure it was at that exact spot. I'm only guessing. On that particular night, my grandfather and the keeper must have caught him setting snares. There must have been a struggle, and the man, as subsequent events led me to believe, fought back and was knocked down by one of them, either my grandfather or the keeper. I believe after they tried to revive him, they realized the man was actually dead. They were both terrified and distraught, my grandfather especially. He'd been prominent in putting down some factory riots and had ordered the military to fire on the crowd, which resulted in several deaths. There was a huge outcry against him, and a certain political party condemned him as a murderer. No one was more reviled. Yet, in my conscience, I believe he acted both wisely and bravely. He stopped a dangerous movement that could have led to a lot of bloodshed. Be that as it may, my impression is that he panicked over this fatal incident with the tinker, and that he and the keeper secretly buried the body, not far from where he died. I now think it was in the chalk pit, and the skeleton that was found there years later was his. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed, my mind instantly flashing back to the figure with the fur cap I'd seen against the window. Sir Francis went on, "The sudden disappearance of the vagrant, given his well-known habits and wandering lifestyle, didn't raise any eyebrows at first. But later, a few circumstances raised suspicions, and an investigation was launched. Among others, my grandfather's keepers were questioned by the magistrates. It was remembered later that the underkeeper in question was absent at the time of the inquiry, because my grandfather had sent him with some dogs to his brother-in-law who lived on the moors. But whether anyone noticed his absence or chose to remain silent, no one mentioned it. The investigation went nowhere, and the whole thing would have been dropped if it hadn't been that 2 years later, for reasons I don't understand, but at the instigation of a magistrate new to the area, someone my grandfather really disliked and who was politically opposed to him, a new inquiry was started. In the course of that inquiry, it came out that, because of some careless words the underkeeper had spoken, a warrant for his arrest was about to be issued. My grandfather, who was suffering from a gout attack, was away from home at the time, but when he heard the news, he came back immediately. The evening he returned, he had a long talk with the young man who left the house after dinner in the servants' hall. It was observed that he looked very downcast. The warrant was issued the next day, but the keeper had vanished. My grandfather gave orders to his staff to do everything they could to help the authorities with the search that was immediately launched, but he couldn't take part himself. No trace of the keeper was ever found, though rumors later circulated that he had been seen in America. But since he was unmarried, he gradually faded from memory, and because my grandfather never allowed the subject to be mentioned in his presence, I probably would never have known anything about it if it hadn't been for the vague stories that always come with such incidents. And for this fact, after my grandfather's death, a letter arrived addressed to him from somewhere in the United States. From someone, the name was different from the keeper's, but it alluded to the past, suggesting a shared secret. Of course, there was a request for money. I replied, mentioning Sir Richard's death, and asking for an explanation. I did get a response, and that's how I was able to fill in so much of the story. But I never learned where the man was killed and buried. My next letter to this fellow was returned marked deceased. Somehow, it never occurred to me until I heard your story that the skeleton in the chalk pit might be that of the poaching tinker. I will definitely have him buried in the churchyard. That should be done, I agreed. And, Sir Francis said after a pause, I give you my word. After the bones are buried, and you've left, I will sleep in that bed in the gallery for a week and report to you if I see or hear anything. If all is quiet, then, well, you draw your own conclusions. I left a day later. Soon after, I received a letter from my friend, short and to the point. All quiet, old boy. Come again. The end. If you like the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.